welcome to my channel. I'm Rhea, and today we're gonna get a little vintagey. I've recently fallen in love with this style, which I guess I've always liked it, the whole peasant top or milkmaid style shirt and or dress. So I found this YouTuber, her name's Lydia, and she made a pattern of a milkmaid dress. So a couple of weeks ago, I went ahead and bought her pattern and made the milkmaid dress. It's a digital pattern that you print out. So I did that and watched her tutorial. She has a few walkthroughs or walk along type of videos on how to make the different views that she offers in this pattern. And doing that, I learned so many new techniques and stuff. So this shirt is heavily based on that pattern. I just changed a few things, like the sleeves, to have the long sleeves, and I made a side zipper, and also the peplum. I made a wrap peplum instead of the little ruffle that she has. So this is the style that we're going for here. So let's get started, shall we? So I have all the pattern pieces cut out. And I'm going to start with the front and back. What I ended up changing was cutting the back portion on a fold, since I'm going to do a side zipper. So I'm going to go ahead and sew these pieces together, as you see. Here we go. And now we have our front and back panels. I went ahead and did the same to the lining. So I'm going to go ahead and sew one of the side seams together, and we're going to leave the other one open for the side zipper. And now we're going to move on to the bust, which the top one is the outer fabric, and then the burgundy-ish color is going to be the inner fabric. So I'm just going to go ahead and stitch about halfway up. And both of these fabrics are cotton. The outer fashion fabric is stretchy cotton, and the inner is just your regular cotton with no stretch. However, the lining of the bust I did cut on the bias. And so now I'm just going to go ahead and do some gathering stitches in between these notches here. And to do these gathering stitches, we're going to increase the stitch length as high as it's going to go. And for my machine, it is 5. So we're just going to do double rows. Double rows of gathering stitches is usually recommended just because it's more secure that way, and you have a little more control versus doing one. However, sometimes I do just one gathering stitch. It depends, but for things like this where I want more control and for it to not move at all, I'll do a double. And so now we're just gathering up the outer and lining of the bust. And then pinning it together. So right now I'm just pinning the bust to the outer bodice, and then I'm going to do the same for the lining. And then sew it together. And it's funny because I love the style where you have the point in between the bust, but it's the trickiest sometimes to sew, to line it up perfectly. I kind of tend to go towards those styles just so I can perfect it because I love it so much. And here I'm going to now sew the lining and the outer together along the top I sewed across the top of the bust and across the top of the back panels. And now I'm going to attach the elastic, and to do this, with that seam that I just did, we're going to go ahead and make another stitch and press the elastic up along there, making a casing and sewing along and pulling the elastic as we go. So I'm going to go ahead and anchor the elastic here in the seam allowance. I mean, don't ask me, I don't know why I tend to sew so close to the edge. But yeah, like I have a real struggle with having adequate seam allowance, but yeah. So we're just going to sew along the elastic there. Which this was just like mind blown. Like I love this technique so much. So I'm really happy that I learned this, and anytime I ever use elastic, I'll be doing this method here. And it's kind of like French seaming, because you kind of have to feel for the elastic and sew very close to it. That at least I'm familiar with, and I used a zipper foot to get really close to the elastic. And there we have it. And so you go ahead, or I went ahead and placed a pin there just to make sure that it doesn't get retracted inside. And I tried it on to make sure that it was to my liking. And now I'm just going to go ahead and secure it with a little stitch. And I went ahead and did an overcasting stitch around the armholes. Now we're going to move on to the sleeves. And this is the lower sleeve, where we're going to go ahead and put an overcasting stitch up there, or overcast the top portion. And down here I'm thinking of making a little bias tape of this fabric and sewing it along there for a very thin trim. So to make this little trim, I'm going to measure the base of the lower sleeve, and it looks like it's pretty much a foot long. I'm going to go ahead and measure out 2 strips for each sleeve. Okay, so now that we've got our pieces cut out, I'm gonna go ahead and press these and make them look like some bias tape. And now we're gonna go ahead and sew right along here and then flip it. And so again, I'm sewing very close to the edge. And do a little back stitch, and then I went and pressed this down just to make it extra crisp, and then hit the sewing machine again. And this stitch just secured it down and made a nice little thin trim with contrasting thread. And here they are, all finished. And now for the fun part, shirring. So for those who don't know, in order to do the shirring effect, what you do is use an elastic thread down in your bobbin. As you sew, that gives it the scrunched effect. For some people, when they're shirring, they cut the threads after each row. As you can see, the first row that I did, I attempted that, but as soon as I did that, I was like, you know what, no, like it's gonna be too much. So instead of cutting it at the end of each row, I decided to just make it one long stitch. And pretty much what I'm doing is lining up the rows with the edge of the foot, which I'm using a walking foot here, just to keep it really smooth and even, and to have the most control, or to have the maximum control over the fabric as you're doing this. So I realized that in order to get the correct distance at the end of each one, you'll notice I go up like 3 stitches, and when you turn it, that will line right up with the previous line, and just do that all the way up. And it's really starting to come together. But of course, the dreaded bobbin ran out, so you just have to go ahead and wind it up by hand. And here's the lower sleeves all finished and shirred. So with the upper sleeve, I'm going to go ahead and do an overcasting stitch and then a gathering stitch. And then I'm going to hem up the top of the sleeve because that's going to be showing. Which later it wasn't 100% necessary at this time, but then again it kind of helped with the process, but I didn't have to. This made a cleaner look on the inside of the shirt. So I decided for these sleeves to sew the lower and upper sleeves together first, and then sew down the sleeve, or sew the sleeves up together, and I did a French seam to close those up. So here's what they look like. And now I'm just going to go ahead and attach it on to here, onto the bodice. So I went ahead and sewed one sleeve onto the bodice, and now in order to sew the other sleeve onto the bodice, we first have to put the zipper on. So as you can see, there's going to be a bit of a gap at the top and at the bottom of the bodice because the zipper doesn't actually reach the full length, which is fine. That's why I decided to change it to a wrap peplum to hide that gap. And then also at the top you'll see, because obviously like you need it to all attach for the sleeve and you don't want a hole, so I'll show you what I ended up doing. And here was my little handiwork. I decided to use a little tab, which it's funny because for this fabric, the maroonish color, I really liked the selvage of it for some reason. It's like a furry almost type of texture, so I really liked it and I was admiring it and wondering, like, I wonder what I could do with this selvage, or like how can I use it. And though this isn't much of it, but I got to, you know, incorporate a little bit into the design. And for the sleeves, I did use a stretch stitch. Alrighty, and now it's time for applying the elastic to the tops of the sleeves. And I'm essentially using the exact same method I did for the bust. And here we have it so far. We've got the sleeves attached and the bodice is completed. And now onto the peplum. So we've got 3 pieces. We have our front, back, and the wrap portion of it. So what I'm going to do with these pieces really quick is do an overcasting stitch across the top and a gathering stitch, as well as hemming them up. Now generally people could hem it up. You could hem up a peplum like this once you've gotten all the pieces sewn together, but I just kind of live life on the edge, so I went ahead and hemmed them all up individually before sewing them together, and yeah, I mean, it worked out. And now we're sewing it together. You see, it lines up. And so I did this method a few times where I sewed the pieces together, since like the peplum doesn't have a lining. So in order to finish those pieces, I could have done a French seam, but I didn't want it to be bulky underneath. Not that they are bulky, but for this fabric I just didn't want to do the French seam for this. So what I decided to do was to do like a regular stitch and then do an overcasting stitch along the edge. So I'm going to sew the wrap portion on at this point. So I used the same method where I used a straight stitch and then did an overcasting stitch on the raw edges. Right up to the zipper. So just to give it a nice look, I'm going ahead and going over the peplum with a top stitch. For the wrap portion, I'm going to install a hook and bar closure. So I decided to use my machine for this. I know this is a little risky, but if you test the distance or the width of your stitches, then you should be all right. I just honestly didn't feel like doing this by hand, so here's what they look like now. And now she's all finished. And then it just dawned on me, like, this would look cute off the shoulder, so yeah. Alrighty, thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new like I did. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like and or subscribe button. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye!